All right, so this spreadsheet on section 10.1 is an overtime calculation, and you're going to be using if statements that are built into Excel. So the first thing that we want to do here for this first chart is find the total number of hours that the person worked. So you're going to be doing a very simple sum statement where you want to add the 5 days of the week together. So you're going to just do a sum statement here for the total hours. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, so remember with a sum statement, you just want to simply do sum and then you want to type in the locations that you want to sum up and you can highlight them. So this is your sum statement and you end up with, these values for your sums. Okay, so that means that Jill worked 20 hours this week, Channing worked 40, Last worked 43, Jonah worked 4.6, 5 worked 72, and 2 worked 35. So some of these people worked overtime. So if you work overtime, a lot of companies will pay you extra each hour to work overtime. So it depends on the company. In this case, let's look at our directions. It says to use an if statement to determine the number of hours worked, and then use the if statement to calculate the weekly wages. They should get time and a half for any hours worked over 40. So let's talk about this for Jill first. So Jill worked 20 hours. So she worked no overtime. So Jill should be paid 20 times 12.50. Okay, that's how much Jill should get paid. All right, now Channing worked 40 hours, right? So he didn't work any hours over 40. So he should just get paid 40 times his wages, which is $10. Okay. Now, Last worked 43 hours. So Last worked 3 hours of overtime, right? They worked 3 hours over 40. So they should get paid regular wages for 40 hours, so 40 times 10. But then for those 3 hours of overtime, they should get paid 3 hours times time and a half, which is 1.5, times their wages. Oops, times their wages. Okay, so let's talk about that some more. So they worked 43 hours, which is 3 hours of overtime. So they worked 40 hours at their regular pay, so 40 times 10. And then they worked 3 hours at time and a half their pay, which is 1.5 times 10. Okay, let's look at 5. We're going to skip. So 5 worked 32 hours of overtime. Okay, so that means they worked 40 regular hours and then 32 over. So they worked 40 hours at $45 plus the 32 hours that they did in overtime times 1.5 times the $45. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do with this spreadsheet, is get these tables to do these calculations for us. So this first table here, what we want to do is we want to figure out how much overtime did they work. That's what we did over here, right? We said they worked no overtime, or they worked 3 hours of overtime. So that's what we want to do first. And we're going to use an if statement. And the way that an if statement works is there are 2 parts to an if. They have the 3 parts, I'm sorry. There's the condition, and then there's what happens if the condition is true, and then what happens if the condition is false. Okay, So the condition is going to be if the hours are greater than 40. So that's what we want to check here. If the hours are greater than 40, then what we want to do is we want to figure out how many hours are over. So we do that by taking the number of hours that they had and subtracting minus 40. If they're not over 40, then we want to simply put a 0 in the spot. That means they worked no overtime. Okay? So now the hours are located up here in these cells. So we have the hours in I-12 and I-13. So we're going to replace this with I-12 greater than 40. And then we're going to do I-12 minus 40. And then we're going to do our 0. Oops. All right. So we have 3 parts to the if. So we're going to separate those 3 parts with the commas. And this is our calculation. So we're actually going to put an equal sign in front of this, and that's what's going to go in these cells here. And then we're going to fill it down. So I'll give you a minute to do that. All right, so we got what we expected here, right? So Jill worked 0 overtime hours. Channing worked 0 overtime hours. Last worked 3 overtime hours. Jonah worked no overtime hours. 5 worked 32 hours over. And 2 worked 35 hours, no hours over. So we figured out how many hours over 40 each of these people got. So now our next calculation is going to be for our wages over here. So let's look over here at this part. So for this part over here, the 20 came from I-12, right? So I basically said I-12 times, and the 1250 came from H12, okay? For this one, I did I-13 times H13. For this one, I did it a little bit differently. So the 40 is not a number right there. There's a 43, but there's not a 40. So the 40 is not going to change, but the 10 is in H14. And then we're going to add, so the 3 that we have right here came from right here. It tells us how many overtime hours we have. That 3 is located in I-23. So I want to do I-23 times 1.5 times the 10 again, which is in H14. So we're doing a lot of cell locations here. So let's look at this part, these 2 parts right here, and let's talk about it. So the 40 came from a number that I know 40 is not going to change. So that's a constant. The 10 came from right here. Okay. The 3 came from right here. The 1.5 isn't going to change because it's always time and a half. And the 10 again came from this box right here. So that's where these numbers are coming from. So now I want to do an if statement, and I'm going to have 2 parts to my if statement. One of the parts is going to be this calculation, and the other part is going to be this calculation. Okay, so I'm going to have 2 parts to my if. I'm going to say if my hours are greater than 40. I'm sorry. What we're going to do here is we're going to say if this is 0, we're going to use these numbers here. So I-21. If I-21 is equal to 0, that means I didn't get any overtime, right? So if that number is 0, then I'm just going to simply say something like I13 times H13. Let's make it right. So since we're doing 21, this should be 12, because that's Jill, and 12. Okay. So 21 is Jill, right? Row 21 is Jill, and I12 and H12 are Jill. Okay. Otherwise, I'm going to do 40 times Jill's wages, which are H12, plus Jill's overtime, which is I21, times 1.5 times Jill's wages, which are H12. Okay, so let's put all of this into numbers. So what I'm looking at here is I'm saying if I21, that's this number right here. So if 0 equals 0, then I'm going to take Jill's wages, which are at I12, which is right here at 20. I'm going to take the 20 times Jill's hours, her wages, which is 12.5. But if this was not 0, then it would take the 40 times the 12.5 plus, in this case, 0 times 1.5 plus 12.5. Okay, so what this is saying is that if this overtime hours is 0, then I'm going to just do this part of the problem. I'm only going to do this part right here, I12 times H12. So that's what's going to happen if it is 0. And if it is not 0, then it's going to do this part. It's going to do this part of the problem. Right? It's going to do this part and multiply by 1.5. So what's happening is the computer, you have to do the same formula for every single cell. The computer is going to decide whether or not they should do the true part or the false part. So that's where Excel is going to do the work for you. So we're going to type this formula that we've got here in next to Jill in the third table. So if you can do that, and then we're going to fill that down. All right, so let's look at our formatting that we have over here. We should have this formatted as currency with 2 decimal places. So we're going to go back over here and make sure these values are their salary, so they should all be formatted as currency with 2 decimal places. So you just want to make sure you've got that formatted right. These are representing their overtime hours, so they are supposed to be, I don't think they specified, so they did not, so we're just going to leave those the way they are. And so that's how you're working this out to figure out your wages. So the thing that you can do now is you can figure out, what if Jill does work a bunch of hours, how much will she get paid, and you could change those numbers. So I hope this helps and you have a great day.